We're also very privileged today to have another very distinguished guest, and that is, of course, Hilary Pyle, who is the Yeats Curator at the National Gallery in Dublin, and who initiated the Yeats Museum in the National Gallery in 1999. So it's not surprising that she is known as the doyen of the Yeats scholars, and I think that's my cue to say I hope you have a very nice afternoon, and to hand you over to Hilary, who is going to share some insights and help us garner a greater understanding and appreciation of our most accomplished and gifted artists. Hilary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. There's just one adjustment. I'm Yeats Curator Emeritus because, in fact, I retired from being the active Yeats Curator a few years ago, but I still, as it were, hover. Now, I've been asked to talk about the exhibition Yeats and Son, and I wanted to start off by paying tribute to Nora Nyland, who was really the motivator of the collection, which has been enhanced somewhat since she came, since she put it together originally. But from small things, great things grow, and certainly I think all of Sligo and Ireland and everybody has to be very grateful to her for her determination to build up a representative collection in as far as she could of Jack Yeats, to balance what was going on with the W.B. Yeats studies in Sligo. The remarkable thing about both men is that they belonged to a family who could work very well together, and father and all of his 4 children worked, developed their genius together and supported each other in their artistic pursuits, and so you can't really isolate one from the other. So in a way, this makes this exhibition Yeats and Son into something very special, because we're now considering Jack Yeats and his father together. I was asked, first of all, to sort of give some idea of their relationship together. Well, it's very difficult, in a way, to describe the relationship of 2 people who were both on a private stage, in that they were creative people, so conscious of their creativity, but they were also on a public stage together. And certainly on the public stage, all of the Yeatses worked openly together. They may have had private things going on, and William Murphy devoted a book to that. But I'm going to talk about them in the artistic terms, and they're very well described in what Jack explained during an interview towards the end of his life. He was asked why he became an artist, and he said, "I paint because I am the son of a painter." Now, that's a very simple explanation, and you can sort of think of him watching his father with his paint tubes all through his childhood and all that. In fact, that didn't actually happen, because Jack Yeats, from the age of 8, well, they spent a lot of time in Sligo before that, the whole family, except for the father, who was working in London. But Jack was, at the age of 8, sent into the care of his grandparents and stayed there until he was 16. So, in fact, he didn't have much of the scampering around the father's studio. But I think that there's something much deeper in this statement, because in it there's an acceptance of a life that's continuous, something that goes on and is carried on and inherited. It connects past and present and future. And you find then that in Jack Yeats's work, particularly his mature work, in the early work, it's a consciousness of history, which was prevalent at the time anyway, because everyone was trying to build up Ireland into a new nation. But he was very conscious of life as something that is past, present, and future. And this became even a subject of his late work. And Grania saw this sun sink. So when you're looking at the sunset, you can remember that Grania, who supposedly was fictitious, but she certainly grew out of something real. But this prehistoric princess saw the same sun sink, and then there'll be people in the future who will also see it. So that was something that mattered to him very much. He would have become an artist anyway, because he used to reportedly, and I've heard Sligo people say this, that he used to draw on the pavements when he was going to school. Interestingly, I don't think he was at school here. He went to the grammar school. The model school would have been a new school in his day, and his grandfather was very much a traditionalist. But I think by the time he started going to school, model school had only opened its doors for a few years. So he went to the more traditional grammar school. And in there he was going to be far away from his father, but he automatically drew, and I think he was probably doing it from the very time he took a pencil into his hand first. And he could have gone on being an illustrator all his life if he wanted. He did it for 10 years and made a lot of profit out of it. But anyway, whether he had his father or not, but in fact, drawing was what they had in common. Another is the fact that neither of them went in very much for nudes. You'll have to look hard to find a nude in either artist. John was an excellent draftsman and sketched in his classic texts at school. He was drawing on his honeymoon, and when training to be a barrister in the law courts, he drew a caricature of the prosecuting counsel, which meant the end of his career in the law courts. But anyway, to his relief, it meant that he could try his hand at being a professional artist. Just as a bit of background, John Butler Yeats came from County Down, the son of a man from Sligo. He was born there in 1839, which used to be well known as the year of the big wind. He was sent to boarding school at the age of 10 to Seaforth, which is near Liverpool, and then to the Atholl Academy in the Isle of Man. So from a very early age he knew loneliness. He wasn't happy at either of those schools. Jack, on the other hand, knew Sligo well before he came to live here permanently, and he lived with his grandparents, whom he already knew. But at least he must have been affected in a different way, that he had, living with these very elderly couple, he must have learned to be self-reliant and independent, because he developed that quite early, living totally apart from his brothers and sisters and brother. There was another brother and another sister, but they died in infancy. Jack was born in 1871, which was when John had recently finished at Heatherley's art school in London. So Jack was born in London. And I wonder, do you ever think about the psychological impact of having the name of your father or else of your mother? It's quite common, really. But Willie was named after both the grandfathers. Lily was named after her mother, and though she always was known by her pet name Lily, but she was really Susan Mary. And I think she actually felt a special responsibility towards her mother, because she, like her mother, was a great, not Shanachie, but a folklorist, you know, and she would tell them stories of Sligo. And so Lily became her inheritor of that. And Elizabeth then bore her Pollock's grandmother's name, And the other two children who died had family names as well. Jack was named John after his father and his great-grandfather, who's immortalised in W.B.'s great poem, Under Belbun's Head. When he started out first as an art journalist, he was obviously very conscious of this and being mistaken for the father, because even still people will want to call him John Yates because it's more official than Jack, or people won't know which Yates is which. But from the start, it's jolly easy. If on the start, as an art journalist, he distinguished himself from his father by using his pet name Jack. He, with typical humour, he rendered the butler part of the name as B, just like American tycoons do. So he was Jack B. Yates, and that was his name as an artist. And he even made cartoons of himself wearing a Wild West wide-brimmed hat and with a huge fat cigar in his mouth. He liked the cigars. But he in a way, except in more sombre self-images, as in leaving the far point, he tended to regard himself as a clown, really. And that, of course, you might say relates to Johnny Patterson and so on. He had a great fellow feeling for clowns. Also for tramps. And that, I suppose, would be the fact that, in a way, he was without a family for 8 formative years. But he did have a business-like instinct which he inherited from his Pollockson forebears, in contrast to his more dreamy father. Well, his father was ruminating all the time, who never had the art agent he could well have done with, and consequently never profited financially from his genuinely original talent. Jack did much better. He did give some paintings to people. He wasn't without generosity, but he always knew what to charge for his pictures. The two never exhibited together either, though both were elected academicians of the Royal Hibernian Academy. And somehow they managed to play cocks and box when they exhibited there. John didn't exhibit so much. Jack eventually did exhibit quite a bit. They were strangely shy of each other. They respected each other as very different artists. John worked at first hand with W.B. He illustrated his books. He made portraits of him and wanted them to be the frontispieces in his books of poetry. He immortalised him in oil paint, and even that very famous portrait of him, which is almost an icon of a poet, that was devised by John. He just, from the start, wanted W.B. to be a poet, and he had enjoyed conversations with his father in the evenings when he was County Down before he was 10. That was something he remembered with great pleasure after he went to school. He used to go into work in York Street, bring Willie with him, and they'd have breakfast together in his studio before Willie went to the high school in Harcourt Street. And he was determined to talk him into what being a poet was like, but not with Jack. He made less portraits of Jack, and the one he made of Jack as a mature man shows a much less self-assured character, but a very private person, somebody who really is not putting on a mask to carry it off, as it were, as Willie was encouraged to do. John actually called Jack the poet of the family. That was one of his summings up of it, of what Jack was like. And at the end of his life, he summed up their equivocal relationship in his article in the Christian Science Monitor in 1920. He had the habits of a man who knows his own mind. And that was how he saw Jack. He would never argue with Jack. He just accepted that he knew what he was saying and was respected it. There is another similarity, though. They both looked on themselves as modern artists, and this is quite interesting. Both were men of their day, far more interested in seeing what was going on and what was happening in art around them, rather than being stuck in academia and looking at art of the past. Rather like William Orpen now, you see, he couldn't get out of being an academic. He was so tied to it and so brilliant as an academic artist, whereas they wanted just to paint real life outside them. They both saw art, as the Impressionists did, a vision of a moment, the blink of an eye, and with the immediacy of contemporary life. John visited the latest modern outrages, that's my word, not his, of the time, by Braque, Matisse, Brancusi, Picasso and Vlaminck. And we must believe we love some of those artists. We can't get to grips with some others of them, but in those days you can imagine just what a shock they were on the system to come in and see these outrageous images, and call that art. But John went to the Armory International Exhibition in 1913 in New York. Jack also was exhibiting in it as a young artist. John hadn't even been invited. But he said he would try, and try again to understand what they were about. He was just determined to keep up with modern art. Jack took a more maverick approach and quipped, "Who the blazes is Glaise?" Hone Angel's French instructor in abstraction. But he did let the innovator's Fauvist excitement wash over him and penetrate into his work. He separated his colours like the Impressionists, and he was impassioned as the Expressionists when he let himself loose in his later paintings. Not becoming a member of either movement, of course. Both he and his father were individualists of their time, and much as they loved contemporary art, they never were drawn into working with other artists. They remained independent, each doing their own thing. John talking and writing a lot about it, Jack saying as little as possible. One typical example from Jack, which is quite important: all drawing is from memory, but from memories of the artist, not of other people's drawing. So that's quite significant. And then, as regards their technique, as a student, John actually went through more reactions with what was going on in the public place. For example, when he became a student, the first thing that excited him was the Pre-Raphaelites. And he was very keen, particularly on Rossetti, and his wonderful, gloriously coloured reforming images. But and in fact, it was a kind of a measure of John, again, his privateness, that when his Pippa painting, which is in the National Gallery, was shown in public in 1871, Rossetti was terribly impressed with it and wanted to meet the artist, but John just fled. He just couldn't face him, so he never met his hero. But very soon, he was then, back in Dublin in the 1880s, he was very taken by Whistler, and he was looking also at the Impressionists, particularly Manet, who a lot of people don't really call him an Impressionist, but he certainly was working with the movement. And he moved on from his Pre-Raphaelite precision to support Impressionist principles, if not their styles, because he never emulated that. It was their ceaseless search for modernism, and modernism is what I mean, just now, this minute, the todayness, oblivious of everything else, no history, no thought of what's going to happen tomorrow. And it was Baudelaire who would be quite fresh for John Yates, who was the person who decided to apply this expression, which was really old. It's a Latin word. He decided to apply it to contemporary art. Just like Roger Fry, then, he had the problem of what on earth happens after Impressionism, which in a way was such a brilliant movement that it's still, people are impressed by it today. So he had to just simply go for the term post-Impressionism to describe the squad of styles that followed the purest of Impressionism. Now, I don't know whether John thought of this, but the French Impressionists first declared themselves in 1872, the year that John Yates embarked on his artistic career. He wasn't in his 20s, but he was 33. And by coincidence, the French artists at that stage of innovation, when they decided to accept the fact that they were giving impressions in their paintings, they also were mature. They were in their 30s. They were settled down and married, coping with domestic problems and poverty. So if he did manage to kind of know much about them, which he might have done in London, he might have felt quite a lot of sympathy with them. He was actually born in the same year as Cicely, and he was 2 years older than the most influential woman in the movement, Berta Morisot. For John, what was most important was not their technical innovation, but the Impressionists' desire to capture the first sensation of seeing. And I think in that room where you see these wonderful sketches he made, they were done in a few minutes. He was a quick worker, and this was what he was trying to do: be as quick as possible, get the immediate moment of looking at that person. Having swept away the formalities and rituals of academic art, the Impressionists were now revealing more of domestic scenes or other ordinary events, and again without moral or emotion in them, or even meaning. They weren't to have any meaning. They were just impressions in oil, and visually satisfying and very beautiful often, but once-off images in pure colour. Domestic suited John too, because he was immersed in his own family during the 1870s as they were growing up, and he continually drew and painted them and his ailing wife. So his portraits never, because of this Impressionist influence, they never become formal boardroom portraits. I think once he saw one might, because Hugh Lane was always at him to paint people in high places, and he would run a mile. The life goes out of the one or two that he did. He wanted to penetrate the inner person, and his policy was, and he said this in his letters, that he wanted to get the sitters talking and let them talk away while he worked, that he couldn't paint a proper portrait without hearing what they had to say. So he wanted to penetrate them in a fleeting image, which was what he aimed at, as being the first heat of a sketch, to quote him. It's why a lot of people about his time and shortly afterwards used to think his portraits were unfinished, but they weren't. They were just what he wanted to try and make them in the mode of the Impressionists, who did leave pictures that looked unfinished, but sometimes they finished them. Now, when he moved to New York, we get his best portraits sort of just before he went to New York, he would have been in his 60s then, but he had two very faithful patrons, Quinn, who was an American, and Hugh Lane. And so the greater part of his memorable core are in those paintings of the people who were working for Irish freedom in different ways, whether it was politically or artistically or writing. They all were people who fascinated him. When he went to America in New York just before his 70th birthday, he immediately associated with the most progressive group of painters there, the Ashcan School, which included John Sloan and Robert Henry. And they became great friends of his. They were challenging the conservatism of American art and trying to blow away the stiffness of the Academy. He exhibited in their exhibitions, even though his work was quite different. And of course, when it came to the international exhibition, as I said, he wasn't included. He never really, even though his great work of the final portrait was an attempt also, but it wasn't of. He was trying to paint the moment for so long, over 10 years, that it didn't come out as a fresh, sparkling contemporary work, but it is absolutely fascinating. He didn't quite make the breakthrough from tradition to complete modernism. But if you know his earlier portraits done in Ireland, and you can see them in the Abbey Theatre and in the National Gallery and the Municipal Gallery in Dublin, you can see the change in his painting style and technique. And you're very lucky here to have the self-portrait of 1916, which is quite a small painting, but it's quite different from his earlier Irish work, and can see that he is really trying to associate with the post-impressionist approach to colour, particularly, even image-wise. As far as regards Jack, his work progressed gradually over the years, but in a much more leisurely way, with greater facility and inborn confidence. He didn't need to be referring to other people all the time. He was conscious of Impressionism and referred to it. But the contemporary painting of his time, lumped under post-impressionist, but when he started that term wasn't used at all, it allowed for much more than immediacy. Imagination, emotion, and memory were part of the whole image. And to his pleasure, post-impressionists found delight in boisterous popular entertainment, like Toulouse-Lautrec and so on the race field and in the music hall, as well as enjoying the calm of the domestic scene. You've got Bonnard. He drew from life, but he enhanced what he saw when he came to making his compositions. And from the very beginning, he was very, very devoted to memory. He realized as an artist that memory was just essential to work. Initially, he, as I said, he'd taken to this current lucrative profession of pen and ink, drawing for illustration in newspapers and in books, because photography hadn't moved in, and this was, and since printing had developed so much, there were so many comic papers and serious papers who wanted illustrations. For all the immediacy that he achieved in choice of subject later on, he had recognized very early on for him that memory was crucial to his way of working. But he did not let it interfere with his spontaneity. He wanted to reach a point when he went through the critical period after he was painting these more representational works there on the right. He started to separate his colours and to break down his images more. But I mean, this involved him over a period of at least 8 years. But he still wanted to get that first heat of a sketch in his painting and make sure that his painting was continually alive and moving. And this is why around the walls you'll see just how each painting is very individual in itself. And if you look at the dates, it will have developed a bit in the brushwork from what happened before. His style in the mid-20s has been labelled alternately Impressionist and Expressionist. And I'm talking, people would call that Expressionist, and then some of the gentler ones they would call Impressionist. But neither term describes it exactly. He had trained his pencil to respond instantly, and his sketchbook drawings are not studies in preparation for paintings. They're rather notes of a moment, which he hopes will inspire him later. And they parallel his father's capturing of sensations, that is his father's way of putting it, which he might or might not recreate quite differently in oil. And I think for anyone who is an artist here and has that moment of, oh gosh, what am I going to paint today, blank canvas and that, he actually did go to his sketchbooks, and he must have gone because he may have had moments of that kind. And then got an idea or revived a memory of something which he then could develop. With his gradually, just to describe how his technique developed, he painted with line, and you see with these early paintings that, and his watercolours over there, that he's using line to outline the images. That makes it clear what they are. They tell what they are. Whereas in these later ones, you do get a rough outline in that face, but then look at all of the other things there that are happening, and you've got to work out for yourself what is happening. There's a scene there. So line, which came naturally to him, and he'd worked with since he'd been working in illustrated papers, he found it was hemming him in. He felt, and this may be what John didn't discover, line was just confining him. And he said to himself that he managed to release himself from the confines of line in order to draw in oil straight onto the canvas. And again, you can see he hasn't altogether lost his graphic ability, because he's always drawing on the canvas, but now it's not held in by an outline. Therefore, he'd lifted a watercolours, that's one of Pauline, whatever, Buick's, her psychiatrist husband said that an artist must always lift the portcullis to let what is naturally there flow through. So when he had lifted the portcullis of confining line, he was able to create room for memories of events and characters which could pour out as they pleased. So time and place become irrelevant in this late work. In all of these late paintings, they can happen at any time. He himself and figures from his novels and books of reminiscences, they brush shoulders in his oils. And in fact, you can see this in WB as well, because if you remember, among school children, and the Municipal Gallery revisited the ghost of WB walking through his reminiscences. Jack, in his images of himself, was struggling for the nowness of a definitive self-portrait. And there is a real nowness in leaving the far point. But who is he walking with? He's walking with his uncle, George Pollexfen, who had been dead for 30 years, and his wife, Cotty, who had, she was dead at that stage. She had just died. And And also then it recalls who else might be walking there in the same place exactly. Just like Alfred Hitchcock in his films, you forget to look out for him because he's usually sort of on a station waving goodbye or something. But Jack, in a way, he pops in and out of his paintings, and I don't know that one should bother too hard to identify him, because I don't think that he necessarily wants to be. In his novels, he was Mr. No Matter. He was also Bowsy. He divided the character, and for his off days he liked to be Bowsy. But you've got to remember this very intriguing individual sense of humour that he had. Anyway, with some of these late paintings, for example, the Graveyard Wall, you will see that his pigment line is practically identical with that of spontaneous sketches in pencil and ink 30 or 40 years before. So that in a sense, he didn't abandon his line, he just moved it so that it wasn't confining him. I'm going on too long. I just say a word or two about the pictures, which you've probably looked at all of them already, and they're mostly from the Nyland collection. There's some loans here as well. There are only 26 of them, but I think it's a remarkable exhibition because Jack, of course, even if you just look at one painting, there's just so much in it that kind of can give you so much of what the man is. But you've got, I think it's 12 of his paintings here. Maybe it's 13, but because there was one there that I didn't expect. But they make us clear, any of the distinction between Jack and John, because John's are all portraits. Now, it doesn't mean he didn't do the odd landscape he did in his earlier days, but basically he's a portrait artist, whereas Jack is not a portrait artist. Jack actually, I thought maybe the portrait of his father, it's in the collection, isn't it? But it's not hanging. It's in the other room. Yeah, okay. Well, that's good, because I just wanted to say it's interesting because John had painted Jack a few times and drawn him anyway, and this is a portrait of John by Jack, but he's done it in stencil, and it's an outline image which you more or less have to have in stencil, a profile of him reading a book. And it was made in Devon, where Jack was living. He went to live there after he'd been in London. And that was where his grandfather came from, so it was quite suitable. It's actually a terribly good likeness, but done in a very simple, memorable way. He had been working in stencil quite a bit because he had a miniature theatre, and he used to do flat images which he would paste onto rods and push them in and out of the theatre as the characters in his plays. So then he started experimenting with stencil on a larger scale and doing images like horses, memorable images, and experimenting with the colour. And in a way, I think stencil had a lot to do with him being able to order what happens in his late paintings, which may at first sight seem rather dishevelled and, what is where. But that stencil kind of helped him to kind of use a shorthand for imagery. Now, I wanted to make just a remark about these two paintings over here, the two political paintings. Robert Emmet at the Carrigagat celebrations, and the priest, which is called Political. He was a man who gave many speeches at the celebrations in 1898. Jack was back from Devon, and he kind of it wasn't unexpectedly came in. He came in knowing it was there, but he didn't quite know what was going on. And when you see his notes, he wasn't even quite sure who the Sligo man who was being celebrated alongside Robert Emmet and all the others. He wrote about the man who was dressed as Robert Emmet, leading Tubber Curry Band, I think. So he thought he'd identified that. And in the drawing in his sketchbook, he's showing the man looking very proud, and holding his head high and looking pleased that he's in such an important position. But later, when he made the watercolour that we see, even though the marching pose is identical with that in the sketchbook, you'll see that Emmet is raising his eyes up to heaven in an idealistic way. His thoughts on Ireland's freedom and what it could be. So that he was, even though, as I say, he was capturing the atmosphere of a moment in what he sketched, he was quite prepared to change it to create another moment in his painting. And we see that over and over in his work. The other thing about it is that it also made him suddenly realise he had gone to Devon to paint life as he saw it. So he painted Devon farmers in watercolour. And they were very good. But when he went to Sligo the following year, he suddenly realised, no, that's not what I'm painting. I'm going to paint Irish life. And for 12 or 13 years, when he went back to Devon, he painted Irish life from the images he'd made in his sketchbooks when he came back for 2 months in the summer. He was bowled over by this local enthusiastic response to the 1798 commemoration, and he wanted to express this ever afterwards in his life, so that besides the thought of Sligo, I think Sligo sort of encapsulates his love of Ireland, and it had to be in every painting that he made after that. This Robert Emmet painting was a commitment to Irish history in the making, as he saw it. And we noticed, and he then also changed the title of his exhibitions. Instead of Pictures of Life in the West Country, it's Pictures of Life in the West of Ireland, or Pictures of Irish Life. And they both gave him latitude to explore all the state of his native country and the events as well. So in this room, we've got various political pictures, the Robert Emmet one, the funeral of Harry Boland. This was quite, I'm sure, a provocative picture in its time, and he just exhibited first as a funeral. And that was the case with some of his other political paintings. Singing the Minstrel Boy. The Minstrel Boy was a very nationalist song. Communicating with prisoners. They're all images not of politics, but of the political situation. And he's showing the ordinary man involved in the political situation. Because all of those people at the funeral were in, they may have been in sort of various army detachments and so on, but they were also ordinary people. And then Kevin O'Higgins, who's the pale man in the foreground, who had a lot to answer for, he's not represented as somebody important. He's shown as a man who's really searching his mind and about what was happening during the Civil War. Besides these, we've got pictures of ordinary everyday life, like the White Shower, something that we sometimes experience ourselves, as Nishin, on a western town. There are stories in these, and you must make them up for yourselves. The Sea and the Lighthouse, which is more personal, leaving the far point. the Ireland funeral, and of course we've got entertainment, of which he did lots of, and Johnny Patterson, who he knew as when he was a boy as a performer. Well, now, those begin with his, I'm nearly finished. I won't say very much more, but I just wanted to say this. So you've got kind of a wider spectrum with Jack. His political paintings begin with those which are 1897. John's sketches there are just slightly later, and they refer to the same fervour. They come out of that same thing that sort of blitzed Jack when he came to Jack, and this great feeling, we're going to get home rule at last, we maybe can't understand it too well now, but maybe we can. But his being of the older generation, he reflects a less dramatic aspect than Jack does. And also he's concerned with the people who are actually involved with all of the manipulations and so on. So he's portraying many of the early prominent figures in the lead up to what they hoped would be the true Ireland, or the Ireland of Home Rule. John never expected any more than that. There's Douglas Hyde, founder of the Gaelic Lead, and he became president. John O'Leary, the Fenian leader, who came back to Ireland out of exile, and he was an enormous influence culturally in every way. Kuno Meyer, professor of Old Irish in Liverpool, but always over in Ireland. And he was, we even read his translations of Old Irish poetry now. Augusta Gregory, the dramatist, and the young poets, Pádraig Colum, Susan Mitchell, and Seamus O'Sullivan. They're all who were creating. There was actually published them in a volume called not New Poetry, but anyway, I've forgotten the name of it, but in 1904, because he wanted to show the new writing that was going to come. And then his daughter Lily, working in the crafts of the New Ireland, and her nationalist friends, Ginny Mitchell and Eileen Costello, who was a very strong member of the Irish Literary Society when the Yeatses were in London, and she was a noted collector of folk songs in Irish, and later became active in politics. Now, the one I don't know is Mancini on View. Yes, well, I'm going to finish with him because really it amuses me to see him there, because Antonio Mancini, Hugh Lane was a kind of a get it done sort of person, you see, and he couldn't understand why John took so long to paint these portraits, which are absolutely wonderful, the ones he did, but he only fell down on the government officials. He didn't really get on with them. So Lane saw Mancini's painting in Italy, and he encouraged him to come over to Ireland, and he started to give him the commissions that John had failed in. Mancini actually did paint Lane and his sister, Lady Gregory. I don't know of him doing any of the others, and he intrigued people with this sort of spider's web of crisscross that he put over his images. But it was behind it, he was old hat. He wasn't, I don't know what Lane was doing. I think he just was in a bit of a rage. It was a great mistake to patronise him, because effectively Mancini was the man who pushed John Butler Yeats out of the scene. And John went off unexpectedly to America. Lane wanted him to go to Italy and learn how to paint. But he went to America, just, I won't say it. But anyway. And artistically it was to his benefit, because not that his sketches changed much, because he did in fact change his way of painting after he went to America and lightened it. He painted some absolutely superb portrait of American women, which are in the National Gallery in London, and Dublin, and fortunately came there because the daughter, who was painted with several portraits of her mother, decided she wanted to give them to Ireland. So we do have a good idea in other galleries, as well as this, of the development of John Yeats's work and how he strived to reach true modernism. But certainly that self-portrait of 1916 gives you a wonderful idea of what he was capable of. So I hope I haven't kept you too long.